And I'd like to call Jim Cohen, the director, out, please, so we can give him the golden thumb. This has only gotten more precious. I'm very pleased to present the golden thumbs from Roger. And Nate is going to moderate this and do a Q&A with you.
Thank you, Chaz. And to help me with the interview is Kevin Lee, the film critic and video essayist for RogerEbert.com. Kevin?
Where should I be? She's sit in the middle, I think. Okay. Can I just say a quick thanks that I wanted to say? I want to thank my producer and comrade, Paolo Calamita, and I also want to thank Cinema Guild, which is the distributor that had the guts to take this on and then did a wonderful job with it. And it really kind of blew my mind that they wanted to take on a film that obviously was a little unusual and not the most commercial thing. And that's what they do. They take chances, and very happy to have worked with them. And I also want to give a shout out to the projectionists. One of the things that's really special about this festival is that they make a point of bringing in some of the most kind of, if you're in the film world and you look behind the curtain for years, there's certain names and entities that are really special in terms of projection, and it means so much to filmmakers. So I want to thank those folks back there for doing what they do so well.
Yeah. In our case, you're talking about James Bond.
James Bond, the other, or known to us as the other James Bond, or to me, the real James Bond.
So where did this film come from?
Well, the film is, for me, kind of a culmination of many years of doing this and thinking things that I think about. And it also comes from my parents dragging me around to art museums when I was a kid, even though I didn't always want to be going. And so I'm indebted to them, and I'm indebted to the fact that such places exist. But in particular, I had the good fortune to be back and forth to Vienna in large part because of the wonderful film festival there, the Biennale. And every time I went, I would go to that museum, and every time I'd go to the museum, I'd go to the Bruegel room, and I felt this kind of uncanny feeling of familiarity in front of certain paintings, and I eventually realized that I thought, it actually has to do with my work in documentary. The paintings felt in a way like documentary, partly because of their attention to detail and to the margins, but also because they didn't necessarily tell you exactly where to look. You were kind of given a certain freedom to roam within the painting and to decide what was important to you. And that was done by someone in the 16th century, but it seemed very prescient to me and very much akin to certain feelings that I had. So that's pretty much where it came from. But it came from a life of wandering around, I think.
Maybe we can talk about that a little bit, because this film is so distinctive from your career, and maybe we should give a little bit of background as far as your career as a film artist, because when I think of you, my familiarity with your work is very much as a street artist, in the sense that you really have this wonderful ability to go out on the street and just observe things. And most recently, you did a series of newsreel type films pertaining to Occupy Wall Street. And in this film, it's almost like we're watching two movies combined, in the sense that, sure, we've got these gorgeous interior scenes inside the museum, and they're beautifully shot on high-tech digital camera. But on the other hand, we have also got footage of you with your handheld Bolex camera, just filming things that you've picked up. And I believe, correct me if I'm wrong, you shot those first as you were just getting familiarized with the city of Vienna. So I feel like that might be something that we run the risk of overlooking, because this film, it deals with issues of art and culture, but you have this background as someone who just sort of loves street culture. You've worked with, punk artists like Patti Smith and Fugazi. So maybe tell us a bit about how these two sides play out in this film and in your own practice.
Well, my background combines, in some ways, the tradition that has more to do with street photography that goes way back to, there are many people that influence me that I love, from Robert Frank to Helen Levitt to Walker Evans, and then on back to people like Atget in Paris in the 1930s. So there's a tradition of making things by wandering around and not having a set agenda, but you just try to keep your eyes and ears open and be there to witness it and bring a little piece of it back with you. So that had as much to do with how I became a filmmaker, or it had more to do with that kind of tradition than, for example, going to film school, which I did not do, or like yearning to make big narratives. And then there was also something that greatly affected and enabled me, which was when I was in high school in Washington, D.C., we had punk rock, and most of my friends picked up instruments who weren't musicians, and they learned to make their kind of music, and then to have little record labels, and how to tour, and they invented it all kind of out of thin air, because there wasn't any access to the music industry, but there wasn't any interest from the music industry. And so they were able to create it kind of free from a corporate model and a corporate pressure. And when I started to try to make my own films, I realized that there was a template. It's not important what the music was or whatever, but there was an existing proposition that if you wanted to do something, you could do it, and you had to kind of invent it. And when I set out on that path around 30 years ago, it was partly because I didn't really feel I had any access to big movie making. But then after a few years of doing what I really wanted to do in the way that I wanted to do it, then I didn't really want that access. So this film, it's on a slightly bigger scale, but to me, it's entirely part of the same cloth. It doesn't feel to me at all like a departure. It feels like a continuity. I don't know. It still kind of amazes me that it seems to have gone farther than the other work, when it's really the same weird stuff,
Yeah. But there is a tiny narrative here, right?
Yeah. Well, there's a tiny narrative about two people kind of getting to know each other, but then, there's a bigger narrative, which is, I don't mean to be presumptuous, but to quote Roger Ebert, life itself is the narrative. It's the only narrative that matters. And if you attend to that in a film, then I think that's really all the narrative that you need. I don't have such a strong attachment to the kind of narrative that a lot of films are made of. It's not that they're wrong to do so, but I don't think it's as necessary as people make it out to be.
Yeah, but what you do so beautifully in this film is just give us a little bit of story to hang on while you give us everything, surprise us in so many other ways.
Well, I thank you. I mean, I hope it's enough to hang on and not to hang myself on. But I liked the idea. I very much hope that people would find enough there in terms of these characters to be kind of pulled in, and then to find that that's not really any more important than anything else in the movie, whether it's a picture in a museum or something on the ground in the flea market. It's all the same fabric, and it's all there for the same reason. And I love being able to work with these characters, and they brought extraordinary things to the film that wouldn't be there otherwise, but they're not the be all and end all.
I think it was a brilliant choice to set this in Vienna, which becomes its own character in this film.
Yeah, well, when I say that everything is of equal importance, I mean the film is also a city portrait, and that's very much in line with a lot of the work that I've done, where I've done city portraits of places in Eastern Europe or in Mexico or Italy or in New York, and I love to do that. And I just in traditional films they use this term B-roll, and there's the A-roll, which is kind of the movie, and then there's the B-roll that, like, sometimes a smaller team of people is sent out to get this interstitial footage. And
Second unit.
And I've sat in many films and felt like that, there's something in the B-roll that is much more engaging or interesting than the rest of this movie that can be sometimes very predictable. And so I thought, what if it's all A-roll? What if you tried to make a movie where everything was on an equal footing? And that's really what was at the heart of this, I think.
That's what I love about this film, is because you resist the convenient hooks and formulas that would kind of attract the viewer. Because if we think about what the great Vienna movies are, one of the more recent ones is Before Sunrise by Richard Linklater, which I feel kind of easily draws comparison because it's about two people, a man and a woman, who encounter each other by chance and then have a very intense interpersonal exchange that lasts a whole day. And there's something similar going on here, but you don't rely on something that movie relies on, which is the romantic hook. These two are not necessarily going to fall in love, and that's not even something that we, the audience, are looking for. You don't point us in that direction. You give us other things to care about. I just want to say that this film, I feel, is so perfect for Ebertfest because it really almost mirrors the Ebertfest experience, at least for me. Just when I sit down at a meal or when I run into someone on the street or just outside in line, just meeting someone and just picking up on a conversation and talking about stuff. There are very few movies that capture that experience. There are very few festivals that capture that experience, for that matter.
So and you're saying the screen is the...
It's almost like an extension of Ebertfest, set in Vienna. And this audience, we were talking about this towards the end of the screening. You guys were laughing at things that I don't think you heard an audience laugh at before, because there was a vibe going on here everyone's kind of together watching the same films, and there's a sense of communal awareness that you pick up on things, very sophisticated things in the film, and I think you really appreciated that.
Yeah, it's a great feeling. I mean, I'm not. A lot of the work that I've done is never shown in movie theaters, and most of the work that I've done never got distribution, and often. I mean, I've had my share of success in its way, but um, it's, as I said in the introduction, I believe that people are kind of capable of thinking their own thoughts, and you can extend that into the experience of watching a movie. You can let people kind of roam around within the movie themselves, and make it their movie. And I felt like, I wanted to do that in a way that maybe pushes its luck a little bit, because I wanted that to be a bit of a challenge. I mean, there's no score in the movie. Score is a very, very easy way to make a movie flow and to kind of heighten emotion. And to take that away, you kind of ask a lot of people sometimes. But on the other hand, the reward is that then they decide what their emotions are, rather than having the director and the music tell them what their emotions are supposed to be. And that's it's become, I think, an unusual thing, and maybe it's a lot to ask, but it has its own reward, I hope.
It's an open text.
Yeah, and it's not that there's anything wrong with score, or there's all kinds of movies, and that's also one of the nice things about this festival, and is that it obviously respects that.
But she sings some very beautiful songs in this thing. Why don't you talk a little bit about her background?
Well, Mary Margaret O'Hara is primarily known as a musician. She has acted, and she calls herself, I think, an undisciplinary artist. She's also draws, and I saw her first about 25 years ago as a singer and with a band, and I was just so taken by her particular presence, and I thought at the time, wow, I wish I could make a movie with her someday. And then, so some 20 some years later, whatever it happened, and one of the things that's going on in this film is that some of it is very carefully scripted, and some of it is entirely improvised. And I really tried to make it unclear which was which. And so there are places where one of the actors is exactly reading words that I've written, and the other one is entirely free to respond with no script given. There are times when they're both ad-libbing, and then there are sections where it's all written. And again, it's risky to do that, but I think it pays off, because you get the feeling that they're talking to each other, they're winging it, and they're not always perfect. They're not always delivering the line that is perfect because 20 people sat in a room and looked at results from a focus group, and they know that it's perfect.
But even then, it never is. Let's see if we have some questions from the audience. Just raise your hand, and a microphone will come to you.
Hi. I wanted to thank you for the beautiful film, and tell you that it reminded me of one of the favorite things we have in our family to debate, which is the question, what is art? And what I found is that the juxtaposition of the magical and the imaginative and creative in the museum, and then the street views and sort of the mundane and either grotesque of what was going on in the bar or a hospital room. So I thought that your film was beautiful. I wanted to thank you and thank those who brought it to the festival. And I love that you ended it with the description of the old lady walking up the path with the very docent sounding artistic description in the audio. And I wanted to ask you what you're going to do next, because I'm all of a sudden a big fan.
Well, thank you kindly. I shoot all the time and I edit all the time, and sometimes things take 10 years to finish. There's usually multiple overlapping projects. I mean, funding is the most difficult thing in a way, and it unfortunately, slows things down immensely. Sometimes, I mean, I'll always be able to make my own little films, and I finish shorts and and toss them out the window. But in order to make something like this that involves a somewhat bigger apparatus, it can be very difficult. So I have one piece that I've been working on for over 25 years, which is a portrait of 42nd Street, Times Square, and I'm not quite sure what that'll be, but it will eventually come to the foreground. And I've been working on a series of short films that are, in a way, in homage to a director who I admired dearly, who died recently, which is Chris Marker, and they're kind of loosely letters to him or related to him. So those are the two things. And I'm always doing some music things. I have a show that has live music with it that I'm working on, and so this and that.
Well, this film was inspired in part by the Biennale Film Festival, right? And isn't the main actor an employee? He's a staff at the festival. And
yeah, he's a driver. When I met him, he also was a waiter in a restaurant in town.
Yeah.
And he's a person who had done a lot of odd jobs, some of which I transposed directly into the film. He had been a rock and roll tour manager. But yeah, he was a non-actor who I had met, through him just being a guy at the festival and I liked his presence and his voice.
All right, so I'm just saying, you're at Ebertfest now, and there are lots of interesting people and staff.
You never know.
You never know.
So you'll be holding auditions after the Q&A. Another question, please.
We have a question here from the floor, all the way to your right. All the way to your right.
I have two ideas. The horse in the picture is kind of reminiscent of the Ark of the Covenant, and clothed lady standing in the elevator reminds me of the songs from the floor, unseen by me.
Wait, I'm sorry, I didn't hear that last part.
The clothed lady in the elevator reminds me of Roy Anderson's Songs from the Second Floor from Sweden.
Songs from the Second Floor.
Oh, which I haven't seen, but I will look for it.
Yeah, the Songs from the Second Floor. We showed that film early on at the festival. Roy Anderson's the Swedish director, and I seem to remember that the first question to Roger on that film was, "Why the hell did you choose this one?" Yeah.
So I'm getting off easy so far.
Another question?
Yes, from the balcony to your left.
So I love the sound editing in this movie. It was amazing all the way through. At the very end, I was a little shocked to see the dedication to Vic Chestnut. What's your connection? I saw on my phone, just Googling you afterwards, what's the connection? I saw that you made a short documentary with him. When did you meet him?
Vic Chestnut was a singer-songwriter based in Athens, Georgia, and I knew Vic for many, many years, and he was one of my closest friends. A great musician, I think a great American artist in a way that is yet to be properly recognized. And Vic was just someone that I talked to about art. You know, it was part of our exchange over many years with, you know, listening to his music and being inspired by it. I eventually produced one of his records, but you know, he had a rough time in some ways. He was in a wheelchair, paralyzed from a car accident, and he knew, you know, a lot about difficult things, and he spoke of them, sang of them with great fearlessness and eloquence. So Vic, I have to highly recommend that you check out the work of Vic Chestnut. So thank you for bringing that up.
Another question?
We have a question again from the floor. You're slightly to your right.
Hi. Before I ask, just want to say that, like Kevin mentioned, the juxtaposition of two characters. One, the man who's in a space with lifeless things, these paintings, these frames, non-living, but they're full of life. And this woman who is in a space where she's caring for a living being, but she's essentially lifeless. So there's that contrast, and they're connected somehow by art and by the details of humanity. So I thought it was a really very touching aspect. And the way you brought out Vienna, because Vienna is it's full of art, it's full of color, but you've desaturated it and making it a very almost bleak background, and yet filled with people and these tiny little details bringing out life. Was that a conscious decision to make Vienna, which is a beautiful city, look sad?
Well, that's beautiful to me. I mean, I didn't really have to desaturate anything, but I was there in the winters, and I basically just thought that, you know, every great city, there's a city underneath that city that you don't generally see, and even the not so great cities, there's a city underneath them too that you don't see. And so I wanted to show Vienna that was basically not the tourist attractions. I mean, they occasionally pass one or two of them, but these were things that I found when I wandered around. I mean, I shared the cinematography on the film, but the exteriors I pretty much shot myself before, during, and after, and sometimes with a crew of one or two people, but sometimes just on my own. And I'd just go get on a train and get off at a stop I'd never heard of, and that's how I found that beautiful bar, and that's how I found a lot of the little things in the city. But I can see how some people would see it as bleak, but it's not bleak to me.
Of course, we can't do this discussion without mentioning The Third Man, which was shot in Vienna, I think, in the late 40s.
There's this one moment in the film that reminded me of The Third Man, when the message comes in that the cousin had passed away, and she turns her back to the camera and walks towards the trees, and he's just sort of standing there. Was that a conscious reference?
Nope.
Okay.
Yeah. No, I mean, one thing that I will almost never do in one of my movies is refer to another movie. But I love it when people find these things and roll them around in their own heads.
But you invite that, right?
Well,
that people should see what they want to see in your film.
Yeah, you know, but personally, my references, I really want them to be kind of life references rather than movie references. not that those can't be intertwined, but I just shy away from doing that. But then again, it happens anyway because you take things in. So, but in that case,
But I thought it interesting that she received the news in long shot, and we see a lot of things we see in this movie are from behind or 3/4.
Yeah, well, all of the film school education that I didn't have would probably indicate that that's the time for a close-up.
It's almost as if you didn't want to intrude on her moment.
Yeah, I like that. That's a very good interpretation. No, I do. I think that's a I don't know that I had thought of that consciously in that way, but I think it's a perfect way to think of it.
I think we have time for about 2 more questions.
We have one down the aisle, close to the.
Could you give us an example or two of the ad libs from the actors that you ended up thinking were as good
Where is this coming from?
as script you had written?
Oh, I didn't ever script anything about the heavy metal band Judas Priest, and that kind of came out of the blue, and so that was one ad lib. Is that what you asked?
Yeah,
scripted versus.
Yeah, there's that, and I don't know, like Mary says, she's describing the flowers, and she says there's this black iris, and you want to put your hand or your fists right through it, which is such an off-the-wall, beautiful thing to say. It's just nothing that you would really come up with as a script writer, but there's something I find very personal and curious and mysterious about that, and I love that she said that. And then there were other things that I had asked her to include in that bit of dialogue. So it's a mix. And when he is describing the paintings, and he talks about the Rembrandts and then this Arcimboldo painting, I had written most of that very carefully, but then he said on his own that they didn't have springtime, that springtime was in Paris. And it was kind of corny, and I probably wouldn't have written it because I would have thought it was too clever. But when he says it, he then looks down as if he's a little bit embarrassed that he said it, and that made it just right for me. So I like that kind of thing. I'm going to have one more little spiel, so don't throw me off yet. But should I go into my little tirade? I'll keep it short. But what I want to say is this.
You can tirade for as long as you want.
Okay. I often do this when I go around with movies, which is to say, if we value unusual experiences in what we read, what we watch, and what we do, then we do have to support the things that make that possible. And when it comes to cinema and this idea of art house cinema and kind of the non-blockbuster, over and over again, it is disappearing for real. And we have to make a decision to, I always say, gather around those things like you're protecting a little bit of fire with your hands, because if you don't vote with your feet and your ticket money and your support, then it goes away, because we live in a culture that is inundated with blockbuster mentality and blockbuster power. And one thing that I was on a panel this morning, and something came up that kind of went right by, which was something called net neutrality. And it's one of those terms that most people do not know what it means or what is being referred to, but there's massive legislation that is in the works and rulings that are being made about it. And what it has to do with is the notion that on the internet, some entities may be able to pay more in order to provide faster service. If that is allowed to happen, it is just simply not mysterious what it will lead to. What it will lead to is that the bigger company will get the lanes on the highway, and the little art film that might have ended up there will be slower to load and easier for people to give up on, because they will just go and watch the big movie from the big company that loads really quickly. So these are the kinds of things that we are, we're living our lives, and these terms come and go, and it seems kind of obscure, but they may really, really, really affect not only what you watch, but what people like me get to try to make in the little hope that there will be avenues for it, venues for it. And so it works big and it works little, but it is a wonderfully hopeful thing to see that you all come out and you watch this, movie, that because you trust the festival, because you trust the spirit that you feel in what Ebert often did. And so I commend you, but it is a battle and you have to engage. Thank you.
Thank you so much, and thank you.